This episode of the Park People podcast is brought to you by BCI Burke. Play is where development soars and communities come together. At BCI Burke, we believe outdoor spaces should be thoughtfully designed, built to last, and welcoming to everyone. Because when design is intentional, people feel it. Learn more at bciburke.com.
Here we go. Hey everybody, Rodney Ott, the Park People podcast from PRB Plus Magazine. I am here today with Sarah Veader. She is the AVP of Risk Control at Church Mutual, and she is here to talk with us today about an article that's coming out in the May issue about cell phones out, safety in, the complex reality behind youth device bans across many spectrums. We're going to talk about it, obviously, in the contents of summer camp and parks and recreation and day camps and whatnot. Sarah, welcome to the podcast. Thanks for joining us. How's life in Connecticut today?
Thanks, Rodney. Happy to be here. The sun is out and it's finally getting warm here in Connecticut.
Nice.
So all is good.
Nice.
We'll take
Nice.
it.
Nice.
Yeah.
So I know that it's a big topic.
Yeah.
Particularly in the summer camp world, there's been a strategy from the invention of cell phones really to keep them out of camp, right? As a let's have a whole, keep the experience as much as we could. Now we're, 15, 20 years down the road, whatever it is. And we're finding out maybe there's a potential for liability. There's this whole thing called the donut method that we're going to talk about, and then we're going to get into some best practices. So maybe could you talk from a 30,000 foot view about, the good, the bad, and the ugly of these youth device bans, maybe where they fit, where they don't, and what people should think through if they've already got one in place or if they're thinking about putting one. So it's kind of a broad question, but we'll let you have fun with it.
We'll take nuggets of it, right?
Yeah. Right.
Yeah. So right, as you mentioned, the discussion around cell phone bans, it primarily started with schools, right? And those are spreading into other industries and areas like recreational settings, camp, after school programs, and sports even, right? And I guess one of the primary concerns is engagement, right? When youth are constantly pulled towards notifications and posts, they're less present, right? They're less connected to the activity. And in some situations, right, they could be less safe. I'm an adult and I feel it sometimes, right? When you're distracted by your phone. I mean, I think it's human nature. But we think camp and rec leaders are well positioned to think through, some of these policies and their programs, because they know their programs and they're very activity driven, right? But I think the stakes around supervision and attention are significant, right? When you think about, if it's a waterfront program or a ropes course or competitive sport, that's very different than just someone sitting in a classroom who might sneak a look at their phone, right? Obviously, there's different reasons for needing their attention, but certainly very, all important. I guess, I would just say the decision isn't just a cultural one, right? To your point, it carries legal and operational impacts that organizations, they really need to think through, carefully before implementing any policy. So we worked on this article to help our insureds in this space and their leaders just take that time to think through the implications and be prepared to address those scenarios.
Yeah, in the article, they talk about, kind of some big bullet points under potential liabilities, right? So they talk about medical and accessibility needs, so that can be a tricky area. Phone damage and loss, if you're taking the phone away and it's being lost, that whole rigmarole there. And then, the one that parents have used forever, at least in the summer camp, and kids have used forever, and it's not always relevant, is like the whole emergency communication. Well, I need it on me in case my mom needs to get a hold of me in an emergency that never happens. Right. There's other ways to solve that. So how do you address like those three particular ones?
So I guess if I was to high level, it's not one size fits all, right? For every youth, every situation and scenario, you're going to have to pivot at times, right? One of, to your point, medical and accessibility needs, right? Children, some youth rely on their phones to manage, chronic conditions like diabetes. So they might, get alerts, monitoring alerts or medication reminders. So you need to have, right, there needs to be a clear plan, but whether it's
Right.
an alternative or do you have to make exceptions? And that is obviously just, those might have to be case by case. I think the responsibility and, just an organization holding and storing devices could open, an organization up to, responsibility for lost or damaged devices, right? So how do you do that safely and make sure that they're managed properly, right? I always wonder about, like, if you're at a camp or a rec facility and they're sitting out in the sun all day, right? Like, did we
Yeah.
did we fry people's cell phones?
Right. Right.
But right, just really taking that time to think through those. And I think, it's funny for emergency communication, right? To your point, the age-old one.
Right.
When I was a kid, we didn't have cell phones, and if we
Right.
had an emergency, there was a way, right? So there
Right.
are, ways to work around, those emergency situations. But it is a critical piece. So, no organization wants to think about in an incident, whether it's an active shooter situation or emergency weather event, but obviously they happen. So just having a blanket phone ban isn't necessarily going to work, right? You
Right.
have to have alternative communication, walkie-talkies, maybe a designated emergency device or phone line so that parents can get in touch, which
Right.
I think most do, but just making sure that that's articulated and communicated is the most important part.
Cool.
It's funny, my
Well,
son,
that kind of
yeah,
leads us into, I didn't mean to cut you off, sorry, but
yeah,
that
no
kind of
worries.
leads us into the donut framework, right? Where we're starting to talk about, as your team describes it, donut stands for development, opportunity, notice, uniformity, and timeliness.
Yeah,
And these are things that you think through as you're developing a policy, right? So
for
maybe we
sure.
could walk through, and then you were going to tell a story about your son, so we can go into that
Oh
real
yeah.
quick. But maybe we start talking, break those pieces a little bit apart, and say, what are we thinking about in development? What are we thinking about an opportunity, and how does that roll up into, eventually into a policy as a whole?
Yeah, absolutely. I was just going to say, right, my son, I have an 18-year-old, so two working
Yeah.
parents. He went to a YMCA camp for part of the summer, and then he went to our summer rec program, actually,
Yeah.
for their camp program, and he works there now. So
Yeah.
he's going
Okay.
to be in his third summer as a counselor at our town rec program. And
Nice.
yeah, it's great. And, it's a perfect fit. And, but if I text him during the day, Rodney, I don't hear back from him.
Yeah.
Which I think is perfect, right? Like, it's
Right.
great. I'll send him a text. I know he's going to get it at some point, but
Right.
he's leading by example. And I just
Right.
think that that's really an important aspect of it too, right? If I needed to, if I had an emergency, I could call the town, I could call the rec department
Yeah.
and get in touch with him. But, to our earlier point, there are ways to,
Has he talked about, so do they have a ban there? I'm assuming it sounds like if he's leading by example, they're taking the
right.
cell phones away. Has he talked about, like, is it a difficult thing to enforce, or is it like after day one kids are used to it, or how does that
I
work?
think I think there are times where they're a little more lenient, right? Like if they're on the bus and they're going to go bowling or to a
Yeah.
beach or something, I think they'll let the kids use their phones then. But once
Right.
they're at a location or once they're engaged with something, all their phones are away. And I don't think it's been a major issue. Um,
Yeah.
I would imagine it's almost like anything, right? If you let it slip, then it just escalates and snowballs, right? So
Right.
I think that they're pretty firm about it, and obviously he's leading by
What
example.
does it
So
mean to put them away? Is it just literally keep it in your pocket, or is it like, do they take the devices from them and put them all somewhere, or like
they're
how's in
keeping
their
them in their own
situation
bags. So like
in
they
their own
bring a
bags?
backpack with their lunches and they
Yeah.
keep them with their own
Right.
belongings. So the
Right.
organization isn't responsible for them
Is that
necessarily.
is that more common from what you guys see? Do you have any data on that?
Not
Yeah, I
sure,
mean,
but
I
I
know there's a
would,
whole industry that's developed around, lockers for cell phones and
right.
and whatnot, right? It's more in a school setting, I think, than anywhere
I
else.
think
But
so.
yeah.
Yeah, yeah, I tend to think that that's more in the school settings. And they're letting the children, if they have a backpack, just keep it in the bag, keep it out of sight, so that
Yeah.
Yeah, that's what I think we see most often.
Okay.
Yeah.
So when you're setting up this policy and maybe using the donut method,
Yeah.
what are the steps that people should think through that might end up getting them to some best practices?
Yeah, so I think, right, when we think about the donut policy, that's just more a framework designed,
Right.
to help organizations think through the development collaboratively and with transparency, right? That's the main goal of it. So you don't want to just announce a change. But I
Right.
think, the development phase, for instance, right, means, you're going to bring together stakeholders, so parents, staff, and bring them into the conversation early. Um, and I think, just another uh, potential opportunity, right, is doing a pilot, right? Maybe a soft launch where, you start out small, do a test, and make sure that the policy is manageable before you bite off more than you can chew, if you will, right? And then make sure that it's enforceable too. So, some groups might benefit from that more than just a policy document.
Right.
And then I think, like, if we thought about
So do
uniformity,
you,
yeah,
on that point, do you feel like, so like summer camps have been doing this forever, so they probably, already have a policy in place. Parks and rec facilities, I feel like it's relatively new. Like,
mm,
people have been doing it. I
right,
don't feel like there's the usual, even in the park and rec space. I feel like schools, it's a big deal. So there's always a public, you know, discussion, right?
right.
I don't know that I've seen that have you seen that in the park and rec space, public discussions on phone, or is it
I
just
don't think it gets as much press, right?
okay?
But I also think, it depends on, kind of depends on your exposure, and I don't think one size
Yeah,
fits all, right? So I think
right.
an 8-year-old in an after school program for a couple hours is
Yeah,
probably, they have different needs than a teenager who's in a week-long sleepaway camp, right?
right,
So,
right,
maybe there's just a little bit more engagement at the forefront
right,
to kind of take into some of those considerations. But I think too, in schools, it's a lot easier to sneak your phone when you're sitting at a desk and you have a
right,
laptop in front of you or a Chromebook or
right.
whatever, right? So I think that's where some of that, like, locking away the phones, comes into
Comes
place
into
because,
place.
yeah, it's a lot easier to my son responds to me in school when he's in
Yeah,
class, but he
right,
doesn't respond to me at work. So I
right,
guess that,
right.
that's
Yeah, that's
a good
different.
telltale.
Right. So you've kind of gone through opportunity and notice, you know, letting people know it's going to happen, right?
Yep.
Uniformity. Maybe we
Yeah.
should talk about that and timeliness, the last two kind of phases of the policy build out, as
Right,
the
right. I think, you don't want to underestimate any of them, right? But uniformity
sure.
might be underestimated a little bit more. I think, you know, everyone's more likely to buy into a new rule or a policy if it's consistently applied, right?
Right,
So if my son were a counselor and he was on his phone, but he was telling, his group that they couldn't
right,
be, no one's
right,
going to buy into it. It's going to be
right,
kind of, unenforceable, if you will. So I think
right,
that uniformity piece is really important. Just it has to be applied to everyone at all times, right? Like when we say it is. So I think that that's really important. And then, the timeliness is just making sure that you're communicating effectively ahead of time, right? Like, we if you think about, if someone's going to implement a new phone ban, but I've already registered and then you kind of change the rules after, maybe
yeah,
that's not going to go over so well. So just
right.
making sure that your communication is timely and effective and gets to the right people. Maybe use multiple channels like
Do you feel
email
like
and social
as
media.
more and more, organizations, it's becoming more of a thing than it used to be that there's gonna be some kind of a phone ban, right? In rec programs and camps, like as it becomes more, uh, I don't know, populist, maybe not the right word, but as it's, in place more often,
Right.
maybe we're getting to a tipping point where people are less up in arms about it because yeah, everybody does that.
Kind of commonplace.
Maybe we haven't gotten there yet, but it seems like we're
Mm.
heading in that direction.
Yeah, yeah, I tend to agree. And you may still have pockets of kind of holdout, right? But
Right.
but I wouldn't be surprised. And like you said, it's already kind of commonplace with
Right.
a lot of, spaces and organizations. So, and I think, schools are really kind of really kicking in and focusing on this. So we'll
It's
probably continue
amazing
to.
watching it take, like our school system did it here a couple years ago. And I mean, the data that they brought, the scientific data as far as why it was a good thing
Yeah,
was insane. You just, everybody knows, they're a distraction device and they're particularly bad for people with ADHD and other issues and certain age groups. Social media is really really, I mean, it's bad for all of us, but
right,
teenage girls, it's really particularly potentially awful for. And to see these safe space created, and people were up in arms for like a minute, like,
right,
and then once, and in the kids, and like once it would just became the new normal,
right,
we haven't heard anything about it. Like my kids, it was just the way it was, right? Like,
right, right.
it was crazy. I thought it would be a huge, like I'd hear complaining from my teenage daughters. Like I thought I was going to hear about it for a year, right?
Right, right.
I never heard anything about it. It was just the way it was. And maybe that
That's
goes to the
great.
uniformity thing. Everybody was
Yes,
affected that was their age, right?
exactly. Yes.
So what are you going to complain about?
Right, right. It doesn't, the person sitting next to you doesn't have theirs either. So we all just kind of have to wait. And
Right.
yeah, I mean, I think it's a good thing, right? When you think about cyberbullying and just so much that can come
Oh yeah.
along with the cell phone and the social media, it's probably good for their mental health, right? Just to
Right.
have a break.
It's good for our mental health.
Yes, yes. Like I said, I know I feel distracted by mine at times too. So
Yeah, and even when you're doing your best to manage it, right, and give it its own space and place, it's still, it's designed to be addictive.
right.
Um, so as people are developing their policies, we've gone through some of the best practices just tangentially here. Um, Making your legal team and board obviously an integral part of the process,
Yeah,
straightforward.
sure.
Maybe including exceptions for students who have medical or other special needs. I mean, I think the exception list is, so you brought up a really interesting one earlier in the conversation about managing diabetes, for instance, right? And if you have
Right,
if your device is actually also your testing method, now,
right,
or
right.
whatever,
Yep,
that's pretty hard to separate, right? It's pretty hard
exactly.
to, but do you see people like saying, okay, well, you're not going to have it the entire time, but when you need to test it, we'll get it for you and test. And is that how
Yeah,
they're managing or?
yeah, I mean, I wouldn't even want to speak to exactly how that would happen, but I do
Right,
think, right, there's got to be some parameters,
right.
whether it's certain amounts of time or you check it and then you put it away, right? And I think that it's probably case by case, just depending on,
Yeah,
that level of dependency.
right,
But yeah, so
right,
obviously case by case. And then kind of working in that scenario that works
right,
best. But yeah,
right.
you have to think about children with disabilities like speech or hearing impairments,
Sure,
right?
right. So it could be an invaluable tool, right? Or is an invaluable tool.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, interesting. Like, there's no one size fits all is what we're saying here,
Absolutely.
right?
Yes,
And
for sure.
having a little logic, but maybe at the same time trying to be as consistent across the board, even with the exceptions,
Yes.
probably goes a long way, right?
Right, right.
Are, are,
Absolutely.
are you do you have any data? Do you have any information on like people who've implemented this and maybe they're well down the path? It's been a few years. Are they happy with it overall? What's their experience been like? Have they
Yeah,
had
I
to go
mean,
back and revisit their policies?
I don't know. I mean, we may have some anecdotal data that I could kind of, query my
Sure.
field team because they're the ones who are in the field meeting with the
Right.
insureds. I get to I'm in the office more, unfortunately, at this stage,
Right.
but
Right. I understand.
my field team would certainly have insight into that. But to your point, I think that some organizations and industries are newer to adopting this, and then some it's just been day to day. And I think for camps in particular, right, if you think about camps and rec programs, they're probably now having to deal with more of those one-offs where youth
Yeah.
are dependent on their devices, right? So they're probably dealing with those special situations more than they ever had to, because 10 years
Right.
ago we didn't have an app connect to your glucose monitoring, right?
Right. Right.
So I would think that's kind
Right.
of where a lot of those groups are at now.
Right. Awesome. Well, and I know we talked about considering different rules for different age groups. We kind of touched on that a little
Yeah.
bit as a
Yeah.
best practice. I think that's probably relatively straightforward for folks. Is there anything else like around this topic that we should talk about? Like, is there any, I guess one question I wanted to ask that I haven't probably correctly asked is there any liability concerns for putting in a ban? Um, like, have you run into people who, suddenly maybe their risk management plan is a little bit sideways because they have the ban in place, or has it not been
Not that I've
an
heard
issue?
of, and I haven't heard of like any claims that we've had. However, I would say rushing or making a policy in a vacuum, not considering, how we're going to evaluate and just handle different scenarios. I
Right,
would say that's probably worse than not
right.
having a
Then
policy
having a
that
ban.
you rushed, right? I just
Yeah.
think that rushing or not, working with your stakeholders or considering all those scenarios,
Hmm.
that would be, a worse situation than, not having a
Right,
policy.
right.
So
So putting a ban in place isn't inherently a risk management problem, a risk, meaning that you're engaging in potentially riskier behavior. Bad policies could maybe toe that line, but you
yeah,
guys haven't really seen any claims, not that you know of anyway, that are explicitly because somebody had a,
right.
a ban. So, you know, it's really more about like all of our customer service policies, right? It comes down to, intelligent design and
Right.
communicate, right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Um,
Engage with stakeholders, right? Talk to those people, right? Because
right,
someone might bring up a situation that nobody no, oh man, we never thought of that.
right, right,
Yeah,
right. Well, and they grow each year, right? Like as technology
absolutely.
changes and
Yeah.
as situations arise, the policies get better. The people enforcing them have a better understanding of what they're doing, what they're trying to accomplish. So it's like everything from our pool policies to our lifeguarding policies to our fitness room policies to our locker room policies, right? They all get better with age, normally.
Right,
So
right.
yeah,
Constantly evolving, getting updated, right? And I think
right,
that's a huge part of it too. And I think that's for eh, and this is any industry, any policy, any procedure, it shouldn't be a document that sits on a shelf, right? But it's how
right,
do you implement it? How do you hold everyone accountable to it? How do you ensure that it's enforced consistently?
right,
That's the where the rubber hits the road, right?
right,
If you will,
right,
right? Just having a
right.
policy that sits on a shelf is not, that's
Not gonna make it
not
work.
the where
Yeah.
it should stop.
Well, cool. Well, is there, you're the expert and I'm not. So if you were in my chair, is there anything that I should have asked you? Anything we should have talked about did we miss any big steps of this process?
I don't think there's anything significant that we didn't talk about. Just, being thoughtful, having a proactive approach. I think proactivity, we didn't talk about that, but being
Yeah,
proactive as opposed to reactive
right,
for any organization, especially those working with youth, is
right,
going to be really important too.
right.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's whatever you can get out in front of, get out in front of, right?
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
You
So
know,
listen to podcasts like this, right? Like,
yeah, there you go.
try to generate some thoughts and go from there.
Well, and we're seeing too, like there's a lot of sharing of information in our industry.
Hmm.
Camps don't really necessarily compete with camps. I mean, I guess they kind of do, but not really. They're usually geographic based and you know, appeal to different people. Park and recs, neighboring cities share information all the time. And
Sure.
so, that always continues to be our advice here is like talk to people who've done it in your
Yeah.
area, right? What
Sure.
went well, what went poorly, what would you do differently,
Right.
right? Like you have a lot of resources available to you just a phone call away and
Absolutely.
and reach out to them as well. Reach out to you
Your
guys I'm
insurance
sure have a
carrier,
ton.
your brokers,
Yeah,
right?
tons of
Yeah,
resources,
absolutely.
right? Yeah. So,
Yep, for sure.
well, cool. Well,
All
thank
right.
you for your time.
Yeah,
It
thank you,
was
Ronnie. Take care.
awesome meeting you.
You
So,
too.
have a great rest of your week, and I'm glad it's nice and warm there. We're in Idaho now, and it's we're on fifth winter, but I think it's our last winter.
All right. Well, good luck with that.
Yeah, we love it. We actually love it. That's why we live here. But it is not for everybody.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I'm ready for spring. So.
Yeah, I hear that.
All right.
Okay,
Take care.
well,
Thank you.
you bet. Take care.
Bye-bye.